and welcome to this episode of Spotlight on Policy. My name is Stephanie Witt, and I'm the director of the Public Policy Center at Boise State University. Today I'm joined by Dr. Jim Weatherby, Professor Emeritus at Boise State University. We'll be discussing a new white paper on initiatives and tax policy affecting local governments in 8 western states. This white paper will complement part of our upcoming book, The Urban West Revisited, and covers 8 western states: Idaho, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and California. So when we listed all of these initiatives and tax limitation efforts by state, we found that something was on the ballot or passed by a legislature in these 8 states every year between 1990 and 2009, except 2001. What were some of the other kinds of tax limitation efforts that impact local governments that you would point out?
And may I say, in an introductory way, we're not overstating this. We're probably leaving some out. I mean, these were the major initiatives. Now, your question is, what others? Well, I might mention, and it's not a limitation, but it's important consideration, is a number of states have homeowners exemptions, have property tax relief measures that may have not passed during this period, but there's been legislation that has affected them, and particularly that's been true in Idaho, where the property tax limitation was significantly expanded by the 2006 legislature.
Another significant type of limitation that we found is the Tabor requirements in Colorado. Could you explain what those are?
Tabor passed as a constitutional amendment proposition in 1992. Has significant limits on spending and revenue tied to inflation increases and population increases, and also had a provision that we don't really have time to talk about in any detail about rolling back or reducing taxes if there are surpluses. Now, as we indicate in our table, in 2005, the governor, lieutenant governor, a number of conservatives got on board with a coalition of Democrats and more liberal public officials to suspend Tabor restrictions for 5 years. But that's been a significant limit on local governments, on cities. The provision in the original Tabor measure did allow for overrides, or what they call in Colorado, derisively or whatever, de-Brucing. Bruce was the leader of the movement for Tabor, so they have overridden that. Now we're looking in Colorado at a number of propositions, one which would include wiping out all of those overrides and putting a limit on the ability to override the Tabor amendment. But Tabor applies to both state and local governments.
Now, the last thing you mentioned, the cutting out of the override, that's on the November 10 ballot, is that correct?
Yes, it is. So our viewers check with us after breaking news after the November election. It will be important to see the impacts, whether these propositions pass or fail in Colorado.
There are also some ballot initiatives dealing with taxes affecting local governments in California in November. Do you want to discuss those?
Well, I would discuss one, because in California, as in many of these states, we could take hours talking about all the propositions that are on the ballot, and I don't know exactly where Oregon is this year's, but sometimes their voter information is a full catalog on all of the propositions there. The one that I think we are most interested in is being promoted by the California League of Cities, the California County Association, and many others who are concerned about protecting local government services. It's well known to people that California has a very great deficit, and they are looking for revenues wherever they can find it, either through tax increases or diverting, quote unquote, those revenues from local government. I say they're stealing or robbing from local governments, but that's a bias, I guess, of mine. But the local governments groups have come together. They're promoting a constitutional amendment that would protect from the state taking or borrowing, quote unquote, local property taxes, local redevelopment revenues, local transit revenues, which in the last fiscal year, the state of California took $5 billion, that's billion dollars of local revenues from cities, counties, highway districts, and others in California. So not all of the, and it's good for you to point that out, not all the measures here are limits on the ability of local governments to act. There are certain positive measures like this that is intended to protect local government services.
As we've noted in some of our other broadcasts, we anticipate that states will increasingly look to local governments to help solve their revenue shortfalls. Do you anticipate that being on the agenda of legislatures throughout the West again this year?
I suspect it might, and this is going to be a tough legislative year in Idaho and many other states coming up in 2011, where their revenues have been spent, where their reserves have been spent, where there's not going to be much federal stimulus money. And the question is, where do you find the revenues to try to aid state services? And you have revenue sharing programs. That's what we're talking about. In some cases, revenue sharing with local governments, and they tap into that, as well as in California and Nevada, go into those budgets and take local revenues.
So they're not just keeping the money they might have shared with the cities, but they're actually going into the taxes collected by the cities and taking it for state purposes.
That's right, because they cannot reach any kind of consensus on either cutting state services or raising taxes necessary to make state services whole.
Well, thanks, Jim. I appreciate your background on all of these initiatives. We hope that you'll take a moment and have a look at our full report that is housed at our website. You've been listening to Spotlight on Policy. My name is Stephanie Witt. Thank you for joining us.